Hi everyone, Thoughts Thinny Prayers Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it is time for a review of the new Liturgy album, Origin of the Alimonies. This is a new album/opera from one of the most groundbreaking names in modern metal music, Hunter Hunt-Hendrix's Liturgy. Hunter is a guitarist, singer, composer, and theologian who has been recording music for years, specifically as the main brain of this ever-evolving avant metal project, which has undergone quite a metamorphosis over the years under the guise of transcendental black metal, especially lately, with Hunter working more classically leaning instrumentation into her pieces, pushing Liturgy's legendary sonic peaks of intensity even higher. We caught notes of that, albeit rough ones, on the ARC work a few years back, then on Liturgy's HAQQ record that dropped last year, as well as on the Antigone single this year, and in an interview I had with Hunter just a few months back now, she told me she was working on a literal Liturgy opera, and frankly I didn't expect it to come out so soon and be so approachable. For most popular music listeners, I think opera tends to be a pretty foreign thing, which could be due to a number of factors: lack of overall exposure, the insularity of the culture. But remember that opera has already proven itself to have a life outside of your Madame Butterflies and your Carmens. You know, rock operas are in fact a thing, and while Hunter rightfully frames Origin of the Alimonies as an opera more in the traditional sense, if you're open to the idea of using rock and metal instrumentation to make grand and theatrical and narrative statements, then there's really no reason to go into this new Liturgy project skeptically, especially since it has such a concise runtime and works in 3 very well-defined acts. There's the first track serving as the overture of the piece. Following that with Act 1 narratively is OlOlOn'S birth and loneliness. Then in Act 2 we see another character or Alimony in this opera, Sem, whose fall and lament is depicted at this point. Following this, we have a 14-minute interlude on the project, which is actually one of the most thunderous and consequential moments on the entire LP, an expansion and a reworking of an organ piece from Oliver Messiaen, which also very much plays into the religious and classical aspects of the music and storytelling here. Then the third act of this opera is held together by the closer, the Armistice, which by definition is an agreement made by opposing parties to stop fighting, stop warring, which narratively makes sense because the lyrics of this portion on the album detail the 2 other additional Alimonies, which are a part of Hunter's theological philosophy, being birthed by the 2 that have been introduced up until this point, Sem and OlOlON. So one thing about this opera that should already be obvious at this point, but I will mention explicitly, is that Hunter is really confronting listeners with the theological end of Liturgy's conceptual makeup here. This record isn't just a batch of mathy, fluid, dynamic, brain-melting black metal bangers. To put it simply, it's a musical story of the metaphysical basics of all things, or Alimonies, as Hunter calls them, which probably sounds really convoluted or even culty, but please let me remind you that, again, this is a personal philosophy, this is not an invitation to join a commune or anything, and there is sound philosophical depth to the liturgical aspects of liturgy. The charts and the complex terminology and the concepts are not just window dressing. This, in a way, is an attempt by Hunter to explain the functions and the existence and the strife in our world, just as any other religious institution might, which is another reason why Hunter's ambitions here are not so far-fetched. So I'm sorry if this seems like too much. I mean, the music here, in my opinion, is a lot easier to explain, but I do think you would be doing yourself a disservice if you were to go into this album without appreciating at least a little bit the narrative and the story going on here. I think it would be a lot like watching a great movie and only appreciating appreciating it for its cinematography from end to end and walking away from it having not recalled any of the storyline whatsoever. Not to get too corny about it or anything, but I actually see the origin of the Alimonies here as a prequel of sorts. If we see everything Liturgy's been doing as a succession, then this record is definitely going back to the beginning, giving us the building blocks that all of the records we've been hearing rest upon. Having said all that, the musical functions of the 7 movements within this opera are pretty straightforward, epic, exciting, envelope-pushing, but still straightforward. The opera kicks off with the separation of HAQQ from HAEL, where some violin, flute, and trumpet curiously feel out these eerie, foreboding melodies, which slowly develop over the course of several minutes into a layered drone, complete with these glitchy skips and edits that were pretty prominently featured on the last Liturgy record. More instrumentation and dissonance comes into the fold as the piece progresses. Then the final minute is quite harrowing. It explodes into a mountain of classical and metal instrumentation. It's an experimental metal opera just thundering away, overpowering. It's a grand entrance and contrasts nicely with the following OlOlOn'S birth, which is not just an alimony of sorts, but a character in this opera. Instrumentally, it sounds like an inception point for sure. Lots of dark, brooding organ calling out against dissonant layers of strings, flute, and trumpet for 1 minute and 40 seconds or so. It's a lot of tension building and transitions smoothly into the following lonely OlOlOn, which quickly gains composure with some heart-wrenching and righteous chord progressions. It's at this point where the musical makeup of the opera resembles that of Liturgy's earlier works, which I think makes sense since narratively we're going back to the past to explain the origin of something. Plus, Hunter creatively balances these more familiar bits out with orchestral sections that add a lot of drama to the piece. Once again, it feels like Hunter's trying to push Liturgy's dynamic limitations with more instrumentation and greater builds, and for the most part I think it's working, especially with the fantastic crescendo of horns and strings ascending over the rhythm guitars in the second leg. Everything in the mix just melts into this powerful beam of sound that is just cinematic. The next 2 movements in the opera, the Fall of Sem and Sems Lament, follow a similar pattern of abstraction and tension building and then cathartic release. The first of the 2 pieces starts off patiently and subtly enough, but eventually builds into this intense wall of free-form, jazz-inspired rock instrumentation. Sounds a little like King Crimson or even Soft Machine or something in between. For the finale of the track, we have every instrument in the mix just laying into a wall of sound that is so overpowering it rivals anything that Swans have been doing on their past several records. Then Sems Lament is maybe the weirdest but most effective combination of genres that I've heard this year. The intro is certainly a lot to take in between the digitally manipulated background vocals, trap rhythms, and very dry MIDI instrumentation, and on the surface, while this portion of the track does come off a little awkward, I think there is some intent there, especially considering how organic and fluid the orchestral bits sound in contrast. Maybe this piece could be taken as a statement also as a juxtaposition of organic and synthetic sounds, maybe modern and classic. I'm sure there are a host of contrasts one could draw. Plus, compositionally, from this point, there are so many radical changes going on in the piece, it's hard to keep up with all of them. It's very thrilling and packed into a super tight several minutes that include these minimalistic propulsive flute sections as well as these down-tuned riffs that come off doom-inspired. Following this, the rework, the Apparition of the Eternal Church interlude I alluded to earlier comes through, which feels like a journey within the album itself. And personally, while I do love the various chord changes across the track, along with how Hunter works in these liturgy-esque guitar passages, there's a lot of contrast across the piece. I'm not crazy about how these discordant pianos keep up this quarter note pacing in the background. It just seems like a really weird and passive way of keeping with the rhythm of the piece. It's not until the strings come into play that I feel like it all comes together. The second half is generally gratifying as a result. I just think up until that point it runs a little tedious. Then the Armistice is a grand moment of finality for the entire record, where, as I said earlier, narratively we have the other two Alimonies being birthed from the ones that we were introduced to in the track list. This is represented with every piece of instrumentation in Hunter's arsenal just piling on in as panoramic a display as one could create. By the time it's over, it certainly feels like something has begun, something has been birthed. So I'll say overall, I loved this piece. I think it is a respectable addition to the liturgy canon. Were there some moments that I thought were a little rough? Yes, here and there. And also, do I wish there was more to it? Maybe some movements that more specifically address the other two Alimonies that are introduced toward the finish of the opera. But either way, Hunter's liturgy here continues an incredible streak of records and projects, deepens the lore in the process, and I think gives anybody who's really paying attention quite a bit of insight into all of the theology that makes up liturgy's conceptual DNA. I'm feeling a light to decent 8 on this one. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Liturgy, The Origin of the Alimonies, forever.